So I'll go ahead and welcome you. My name is Amy Starczewski. I direct the Oral History Master of Arts program here at Columbia. And tonight's event is part of our year-long series on oral history and storytelling. So we're asking all kinds of questions about what the relationship between those two things is. Is storytelling different from oral history? We live in a world where storytelling seems completely ubiquitous. And we know that oral histories are full of stories, and that when people are sharing their oral histories, they use all kinds of tips and tricks and tools from storytelling to make sense of their lives. But at the same time, there's a lot of the work that we do in oral history that I think tries to capture the parts of our lives that are more complicated than can be encapsulated in a story. And so I'm really excited to have Ted Kerr here with us this evening to think about the way that we are making narratives, especially in this present moment. I had the privilege of being one of the lead interviewers on Columbia's September 11th, 2001 Oral History Narrative and Memory project. And now to be playing a similar role in a project that we're just starting about the New Yorkers' experiences of COVID-19. And we were fascinated with all the different ways that people used the past to try to make sense of that present moment. And in particular in the way that talking with people as the crisis was unfolding and before a sort of mainstream public narrative emerged, we were able to learn really surprising things about the kinds of historical analogies people were making and what that told us about what kind of event they thought they were experiencing. And so we're especially pleased to have someone here who has been doing research for over 15 years on the AIDS and HIV experience, and particularly the early years of the AIDS and HIV epidemic. I want to a little bit more formally introduce Ted. He is Canadian born. He's Brooklyn based. He's a writer, organizer, and artist whose work focuses on HIV/AIDS community and culture. His writing has appeared in Women's Studies Quarterly, The New Inquiry, BOM, CBC, among other places. He earned his master's degree from Union Theological Seminary, which is right around the corner from where we usually hold these events. And in 2016, 2017, he did interviews for the Smithsonian's Archives of American Arts, Visual Arts, and the AIDS Epidemic Oral History Project. He received his oral history training from Oral History Summer School, and I'm really glad to be bringing Oral History Summer School folks in to this conversation. And he is a founding member of What Would an HIV Doula Do Collective, which is a community of people committed to better implicating community within the ongoing response to HIV/AIDS. And in 2019, he edited What You Don't Know About AIDS Could Fill a Museum for the Academic Journal on Curating. And I think we're realizing right now that there's a lot we don't know and need to know and should know, in particular about the early years of the AIDS epidemic. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted. And I'm going to make his, there we go. Okay, Ted. Are you?
Hi, am I good?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, that was such a generous introduction. Thank you so much. And it's really exciting to see people from all over the world and all the different parts of our lives on this screen together. It's very exciting, a little bit emotional. Maybe we're all emotional a little bit right now. I want to first say that, yeah, as was said, I'm currently in New York. I'm on Lenape land. And I think that's really important to acknowledge even when we're in the digital space, or maybe especially when we're in the digital space. I want to say that I am from Canada and I'm living in the United States, and both of these are countries that were built up on stolen labor, and I don't think we should forget that. And maybe another thing that it's good for us to think about too is that this technology that we're using is technology that so many of our peers who are living with disability, who have complicated lives, whether it's because they have children and they're having to take care of their parents, or they live far away, or they don't want to go outside. They've been advocating for this kind of interface to meet and to do our work and to be social. And so many of our institutions and so many of us have said no to it because we thought it was too difficult. And now within a relatively short amount of time, we're all embracing it. And if you think about this, the stolen land, the stolen labor, and the stolen opportunity, there's this kind of vicious cycle that I don't want us to forget about. And I'm not starting us off on this conversation to be depressive, but just to say that every day is an opportunity that we can break those cycles, and the breaking begins by just telling those stories. I'm gonna take my headphones off now because I realize I'm gonna be playing some audio for y'all later. So second. I have been excited and nervous to do this event, in part because of technology, and in part because it matters. I want to do a good job for everybody, and I'm talking about and with communities that are often overlooked and overshadowed. And so I also am aware of everyone who's participating in this conversation. I'm aware of the ghosts that are here, the people who can't access because of technology, and the people who just, are working on the front lines or for so many reasons can't join us. So I'm just thinking about that. In order to calm my nerves, I did write something, and listen, if this is the only thing you get out of today, you will be completely fine. I know it's hard to listen to people read, so I am going to share an image of me and Alanis Morissette when I was a child, and I'm hoping that that will, yeah, I'm hoping that, oh, which one do I do? Just a second.
Take your time.
Thank you for saying that. That was actually really helpful. Oh, there we go. Okay, so while you look, can everyone see the picture of Ted and Alanis from the 90s? Yes, okay. Yeah. So you look at that while I read this. In the urgency of trying to understand, we craft stories to catch up with the unknown. Within this journey is a problem. All stories are limited by their makers. As much as a story opens up knowledge, it also creates foreclosure, a secreting of knowledge in the narrow folds of our bias, hiding information in the rigidness of our judgments until we figure out another way to tell the story, or maybe another way to hear it. At some point, I think people in the USA will be able to admit that racism disallowed us to see COVID-19 as anything but a threat coming from China, and that this version of the novel coronavirus story cost lives and resulted in unneeded suffering. I know from my own work, we're still wrestling with how early narratives around AIDS and homosexuality disengaged the public and others from seeing the impact of the brewing epidemic in multiple communities, and how this resulted in cruel and biased lack of life-saving resources for women, Black people, and other communities dying with the virus. It was not until women fought to have the narrative of who could receive an AIDS diagnosis that the story of the epidemic began to open up. Ideally, in the fog of our early confusion, we can be more nimble in our uncertainty, alert to our prejudice and what it disallows. Maybe what we need is a greater capacity to have stories that make space and the unknown. What does storytelling look like that does not have answers? That is as compelling in the drive for an end as it is grounded in acceptance of the unknown. So that's the only thing that I'll be reading. So there we go. That's cool. 3 texts that I think could be interesting, or 3 things that could guide us tonight. I won't be referencing beyond just reading them right now, but I just wanted to point them out. One is this beautiful idea of just memory that comes from the book Nothing Ever Dies. And in it, Viet writes, a complex ethics of memory, a just memory that strives both to remember one's own and others, while at the same time drawing attention to the life cycle of memories and their industrial production and how they are fashioned and forgotten and how they evolve. So that's the idea of just memory. Then the idea of collected memory, which comes from James Young, who's thinking about September 11th. And this, I'm not going to read it because I promised I wouldn't read anymore. Basically, what he's saying is this idea that memorials are political, and everything that is in service of building that memorial is part of the memorial. So right now, we are working towards a collective or collected memory of COVID, and all these micro histories that we're ignoring or that we're keeping are part of it. So that's something to consider. And then lastly, this idea of counter-memory by Emily Towns. And she's a womanist theologian. And basically what she's arguing is that when your histories are not told or they're hard to find, that it is okay to use imagination, it is okay to use the body, and it is okay to use community to find and make those stories. At the end of tonight's call, I'm going to be putting together an email, and that email will go out in the next few days, so I'll ensure to include these. What I thought would be nice is if the first voice you heard, besides the two voices you've heard already, is from narrator Kiara St. James, who is the co-founder and executive director of the New York Transgender Advocacy Group. And she was interviewed in 2007 by Michelle O'Brien for the Trans Oral History Project. And what you need to know before hearing this oral history, this 3.5-minute clip from an oral history, is that before Kiara moved to New York, she was part of a very intense kind of conservative church that she left in Texas. Her job during the space of the story she's telling was that of a sex worker in New York City in the 1990s. And Housing Works plays an important part of this story, and it's a hyper important AIDS service advocacy institution in New York. And so I'm going to play that now. Let's see.
Ted, we might want to unshare the screen and then reshare. I think that that Zoom has somehow switched up your windows of what's shared.
Oh, so what are you seeing now?
Seeing sort of the whole screen of up above is the PDF in the background, and then the front window is the web browser.
Okay, let me see if once I switch, it goes okay. I'm gonna play it and then I'll switch my screen.
Great.
For me, happened by accident. I've always been an activist, but at the same time, because like I said, at Kojic, Church of God in Christ, I had this condemning. I felt condemned in my spirit. I wasn't meant to have good things in my life. Other folks could have good things in their life, not me. I remember like we have this term called breaking sunset, where girls who are on the stroll, we stay out until the sun's coming up. And I remember this was on 13th Street, what is now like the meat market area that is all posh. Gansevoort Hotel, the High Line. Let me tell you, none of that existed back then. It was nasty, but it was a lot of fun. A lot of money was made back there. But leaving, I remember hearing somebody call my name, and I happened to look. It was like a group of folks getting on the bus. And during that time, I found myself like homeless, and I was going towards Island Shelter. And so I went over to see who called me, and they're like, "Girl, come on, you better get on this bus." I'm like, "Where y'all going?" And they told me I was going to DC to fight for Ryan White funding and that. I don't know anything about Ryan White funding or anything like that. I'm like, how long is it from DC to here, to New York to DC? And when they told me it was like 4 hours, give or take, the only thing I was thinking about is that's 4 hours for me to get some sleep and not be disturbed. And so I got on the bus because there was room for me to get on the bus. Like halfway through New Jersey, someone tapped on my shoulder and woke, because I was asleep, because I was mad tired, woke me up, and they told me I needed to sign for a stipend. I'm like, a stipend? Like, yeah, you get a stipend for the day, and da da da. At the time, I believe the stipend was $25. I'm like, ooh, you get a stipend, okay. You know, and so I signed. I went back to sleep, and then I was trying to think of like, okay, when I get to DC, where can I go to like get some more sleep? And I remember like once I got to DC, there were all these other organizations from around the nation there. And I remember like I saw a lot of gender nonconforming people, a lot of trans people, people of color, people who just had this energy and this passion. And I'm like, wow, where I forgot about what I was going to do, to where I just got in a mix of like holding signs. They asked people to volunteer to hold banners and different. I'm like, okay, you know, because I was meeting all these amazing people, and so it really inspired me, like to like, oh, I want to do this more. This is, you know, it was fun listening to people talk about the rights of people living with HIV for housing, and you know, there's a lot of like speakers and folks who did not treat me like I had like a third eye. Some, you know, like, you know, they treated me like a human being. You know, they didn't look at me like, oh, what is this Black queer person who has like, and I looked a mess. Did you see pictures of me back then? Thank God there was no internet. But
So I wanted to share that that clip of Kiara St. James, because in it she's talking about origin stories for her as it relates to HIV/AIDS, and I'm interested in thinking about how we are in a moment of origin stories when it comes to COVID-19, and we're figuring out the stories, we're figuring out what we're living in, we're figuring out how we want to tell the stories and the stories that we want to tell. And we're figuring out how maybe different ideas of what's going on can be in conflict and can be in harmony together. One thing that is important for me as somebody who's been doing this AIDS work for a long time is thinking about like, the reason why origin stories matter is because something that Dr. Tracy West tells us is that the stories we tell dictate the action we take, and where we start a story demonstrates our bias, our ethic, and our motivation. And we're not going to see the full extent of that when it comes to COVID, but I can tell you from my own work that we can see it when it comes to HIV. So I'm going to go through a little bit of AIDS history, and I'm going to try sharing a screen again, but this time be a little less messy about it. So let's see. I am going to do maybe this, and then share, and then this. Nope. This. It's loading. Okay. Does that look better? Okay.
Yeah, that looks
So,
great.
okay, great. So that's the origin stories matter. The stories we tell dictate the action we take. Where we start a story demonstrates our bias, our ethic, and our motivation. In the early days of HIV/AIDS, what we got a lot of through the mass media were images of sick white gay men, and they weren't always labeled as gay, but pretty soon that was what caught on. And what was happening at the same time that we weren't hearing about was all the amazing grassroots activism that was being done to shape the stories that were being told, that were pushing back against the stories that were being told. So that pink illustration is an illustration of people who wrote the Denver Principles. And the Denver Principles were created by people living with HIV in 1983, who maybe most famously said, we are not victims, we are sometimes patients, we are first and foremost people living with HIV. And that people first conversation is still very much in the process of our world. The other image is the pamphlet, How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, One Approach. And again, this is about people figuring out how to have intimacy during a pandemic. And while it's quite a controversial pamphlet, one of the most beautiful things that it suggests is that affection is one of our best protections. And I think that's interesting to think about in this day and age. How do we show affection while distancing? Maybe being distant is how we show affection. What we didn't get a lot of back in the day was the people who were trying to say that HIV was not just about white gay men, was not just about adults, was not just about what was happening in Chelsea or in the West Village, that in fact it was something that was affecting people all over the country. And I'm going to do this messy thing where I'm going to play a clip and you will kind of get to see it, I guess. Let's see. This is so, I'm so excited to be so vulnerable with all of you. So I'm going to show this clip of this documentary, just like less than 2 minutes. And in this documentary, you're going to hear about a doctor who, well, let him speak for himself.
Human. In 1978, at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, REA began seeing children with a mysterious type of immune deficiency.
They came with swollen glands, enlarged liver and spleen, followed by all kinds of bacterial infections.
Initially, intravenous antibodies protected the children, but eventually, many children contracted the same opportunistic infections that had plagued or even killed their parents. Yet REA's reports that women may be transmitting an infectious agent to their children were not accepted by many in the scientific community.
Social work.
So one thing that we know now is that often that New York Times article from 1981, the June 1981 news article that says mysterious illness affecting gay men, often that seems to be the starting point for a lot of people, or the CDC report that talks about the 5 gay men who have a mysterious illness. Those are often shown as the first media times of HIV/AIDS. But we know that actually the New York Native had a story that was earlier in which Dr. Larry Mass was saying that maybe there's a cancer affecting gay men, and that the CDC tried to debunk that myth. And that also, as you heard from Dr. Rubenstein, he was trying to talk about the children and the women that he was seeing up in the Bronx who were showing the same symptoms as the gay men in California and New York, but nobody was hearing these stories. That kind of erasure, that kind of ignoring didn't stop then. In fact, the story of white gay men and HIV just kind of got doubled down. And it's here where we really get to see the kind of US media motivation behind the AIDS story. So famously, the New York Post had this headline, "The Man Who Gave Us AIDS," and it was this narrative about how HIV came to the United States because of a promiscuous white French-Canadian flight attendant who gave it to a bunch of people. And we know now that this was a fabrication and due to some clerical errors, and it just blew up into this whole story because of people who wanted to sell books. And right now we're starting to see this with COVID-19. There's a desire to kind of create a narrative of who the patient zero of COVID-19 in the United States is. And we know that early reports coming from China fueled the anti-Asian racism that already happens. And it's interesting to see how that will play out. At the same time that the story of Gaetan Dugas, who was the flight attendant, was happening, October 1987 was when that news article was published. There was another narrative that was also brewing that people were not talking about as much. In 1987, it was confirmed that Robert Rayford, a 16-year-old Black teenager living in St. Louis, died in 1969, and by testing his tissues, it was confirmed that he had died with HIV. This story about Robert Rayford came out at the same time as Patient Zero's story came out about the flight attendant. And in my work, I theorized that almost like the American media had a choice. It could choose between a story that confirmed suspicions about homosexuality, that confirmed and made a villain out of people living with HIV, rather than embracing a story that would have raised questions, that would have made us look at the heartland of America, that would have made us look at the health outcomes of Black people, of youth, and of people living outside of what we thought of as the hotspots of HIV/AIDS. And I think that we're still suffering from that choice to focus on the promiscuous white person rather than, and I said promiscuous white person in quotes, but you can't see me, rather than focusing on Robert Rayford. We see this kind of tension about the stories we tell and don't tell about HIV/AIDS in the statistics that get offered. Statistics, as many of you may already understand, are a form of storytelling. They're a way of collecting data and presenting data. And I found this to be very interesting. This comes from 2003. And you can see the author from the Center of HIV Information really trying to wrestle with the I would say the historical anti-Black racism that's embedded in government statistics with the narrative that they're seeing in their work. So the report says, the characteristics of the first 50,352 cases reported between 1981 and 1987 to the CDC differ significantly from the characteristics of the 69,151 cases reported a decade later in 1996. The epidemic has become increasingly an epidemic of non-white populations, of women, and of heterosexuals and injecting drug users. What the writer doesn't say is that maybe it was systemic, maybe who was impacted by HIV didn't change, but maybe who was being tested is what changed, or who is being cared for was being changed, or who was being counted was changing. So why does it matter? That's all the past, right? Like, we now have, in 1996 was the introduction of life-saving medication that, that makes it possible for HIV to go from a certain death sentence to manageable chronic illness. So why am I delving and dwelling on the stories we tell and don't tell in the past? Well, the stories we retell also matter. A phrase that my friend and co-author Alexandra Uaz and I came up with is the AIDS crisis revisitation. And we see this as this kind of cultural phenomenon starting in 2008, where all of a sudden, after a period I call the second silence, where AIDS wasn't talked about, there was all this really intense media attention on HIV/AIDS. We saw it in famous movies, in books, in plays, in books, in art shows, in art making. As a teacher, I saw so many of my students who hadn't been interested in HIV suddenly more interested in HIV/AIDS. And I won't get into why I think that happened, but the content of that work was mainly focused on white cis gay men from New York, LA, and San Francisco. And for good reason, of course. There's lots of important stories to tell. There's a lot of beautiful footage, amazing archives, and important artifacts that remain that tell those stories. And the men, some of them are who are living, some of them who have died, are important figures to people who are able to tell their stories now. But what happens is this is not shared as just a sliver of a story or part of a story. It is sold to us as the story of HIV/AIDS. So this is what we get a lot of now. What we don't get a lot of now are the stories of other people impacted by HIV/AIDS at the same time as those men were living. So I'm going to play an oral history from the Brooklyn Historical Society. In 1991, 1992, they were planning a show called AIDS Brooklyn, where they did a series of oral histories with people in Brooklyn. And these oral histories are really powerful, and they really tell, one could argue, a counter narrative to the AIDS stories that we often hear. So we're going to play this one. And this is Allison, and she was in conversation with Robert.
When were you diagnosed?
I was diagnosed in 88.
And how did that happen?
I was in a therapeutic community at that time, and there were a lot of people there that were positive. And I liked it, and so I knew that I had, well, talk about risk, God, you know. I just knew that I had to be positive. And I was scared to find out. Because I don't know, like somewhere in my head, it was like, you test positive and then you die tomorrow. You know? And some people died while I was in this therapeutic community, and some people were living with it, and some people used to whine and fume and cry about it. And it was like, well, you know, if so long as you don't test, you don't have to deal, you know. And then I started thinking, well, you know what? Maybe if I find out that I am positive, that will give me an initiative to never again use drugs. I was getting ready to start working and all this other stuff. And it's like, oh, maybe, you know, maybe getting a positive status will be like a guarantee that I won't use again. And then there was this, the other part of me that wants to die. You know, there's that other part of me. Well, maybe if I do get tested, well, then I will die tomorrow. And I won't have to deal with getting a job and growing up and going to live on my own. And I had all these different things.
I really recommend listening to all of Allison's oral history. It's really powerful. And Robert Sember, who you may know from previous talks, is such a gifted oral historian who really makes space for a narrator to share their story. What I'm interested in thinking about is, so often these stories about white cis gay men and HIV become stories of gay history triumph. AIDS becomes a chapter that's in the past that is something that was overcome, and that we can honor now that we have gay marriage and we have more state stability. I'm interested in thinking about, like, what would it mean if, alongside of hearing about the amazing writing or the amazing writing of David Wojnarowicz or the amazing activism of Peter Staley, if we heard more voices like Alice's? What would it mean to hear about the experiences of a Latina lesbian who has a history of drug use, and how could thinking about AIDS and drug use and Latinx culture help us understand the opioid epidemic a little bit more, or help us understand who and what we're missing when it comes to COVID right now? I think that HIV/AIDS has a lot to teach us about how we could deal with COVID, but if we look at it too narrowly, we'll only get narrow stories. Speaking about the COVID-HIV connection, there's a plethora of stories coming out from various news sources about HIV and COVID-19. Both The Body and Pause are doing amazing reporting, looking at the connection between HIV and COVID, talking to long-term survivors with HIV to talk about their trauma and the way that COVID-19 is creating a kind of PTSD moment for them. And they're also talking about young people who are living with co-infection, which is not only COVID and HIV, but also maybe Hep C, HIV, and COVID in all these interesting ways. Sadly, though, that kind of whiteness of the AIDS crisis revisitation that I talked about a few slides ago is painfully apparent in a lot of these news stories, especially from the more major news sources like The New Yorker and The New York Times. What we're not getting now are stories about from the past that could be helpful to think about who is being missed, whose work could help us understand what we need to do next. Specifically thinking about people in jail and people in prison. Earlier I alluded to the work of changing the definition of AIDS. Before 1993, women could not get an AIDS diagnosis, which meant that they couldn't get the resources they needed to live and die with dignity, and they couldn't even get on tests to see if some of the medication that was coming down the pipe would work for them. There's many ways to tell this story. The ACT UP Oral History Project, where Sarah Schulman does all the interviews, is such a resource for this. So we're going to hear from Heidi. We're going to play it from my phone and see what happens.
Was using the CDC's definition of AIDS as the only way that you were going to qualify for disability. So women were getting sick and in many cases dying without an AIDS diagnosis. So you got a couple things going on. You've got an inaccurate portrait of the epidemic, because some of these women are dying without having an AIDS diagnosis. They're not counted in numbers. And then they're not getting benefits. So, they're sort of getting screwed from a couple different angles. And so a bunch of us, and I think it originated out of the Women's Committee, but, I always, these interviews make me nervous primarily for one reason. My memory, I don't always think is accurate, and it's not only colored with time, but then also my opinion. But I'll just say what I remember. What I remember is that ACT UP had gone to Atlanta to the Center for Disease Control and done several actions, and the CDC still had not changed the definition. And So as I recall, Tracy and I, who were lovers at the time, said, let's come up with a year-long campaign to win, to get them to change the definition. How do we get from here to here? And we are going to make their lives miserable. They will have to change the definition because we are going to be at them at every turn. So we came, I think we went to the women's committee, but I don't really remember. That kind of makes sense, but who knows? Anyway, so this plan that we had it had several different layers. It was a campaign. And
so I love that clip for many reasons, not only because it begins to tell the story of how groups of activists led by women, and as I can tell you in a zine that I'll talk about later, specifically Black women in prison living with HIV, did this AIDS activism to change the definition. But of course, I'm talking among and with people who are oral historians or who care about oral history, and I love the way that Heidi names her fear or her anxiety about sharing a story, because it's about memory and how this kind of like fear of putting something on the historical record that might not be correct is literally the thing that we want. I personally want there to be lots of memories and opinions and different kind of conflicting, I think, ideas on the public record. And right now, when it comes to HIV, we don't have enough stories. We need more stories. We need things that produce conflict, that create questions, that create a kind of tension, that invite us to ask more questions. Now my next slide is, and I think one of the reasons why telling stories matter is because even though the United States and Canada has over 200 AIDS memorials, everything from beautiful, well-tended gardens in San Francisco and I think even Saskatchewan to interesting and maybe confusing architectural moments in New York City and Vancouver, what we see is that, or what I would argue is that the best memorial are the steps that we take to care for the people that are most in danger right now of premature death. I actually think that when we support people historically marked for premature death, that is the best memorial we can do. For me, every needle shared is better than any monument we could erect. And in this moment where people are dying and people are suffering, I'm so excited to hear that there's also an effort to try to collect stories, because if we collect stories at the moment of tension and at the moment of trauma, then we don't risk forgetting the micro-histories, the intimate emotions, and we know that so many of us will be pressured into forgetting some of the hardest moments of these previous weeks. And if we do oral histories now, we're invited to let go of those hard tensions and that pain and to put it somewhere so that other people can help us hold it in the future. In that respect, I do think that AIDS activism has helped change the stories we tell when it comes to the statistics and the official response. I'm not going to read this now because I want us to have more time for conversation, but I will share this with you all. And it's basically an updated version about kind of the new standard of how we talk about HIV and statistics. And we are very careful to wrap it in identity and to make sure that we're talking about all the communities that are impacted. Personally, I am, humbled to say that I'm part of a really robust community of people responding long-term to HIV, but also very rapidly to COVID-19. And along with Ripley Soprano, we've been hosting these Zoom conversations where we put out an idea and then we set a date and then we invite people to come, and we don't record the Zoom conversations. We don't even allow screenshots, but we do take notes. And then we put those notes in a Google Doc and we invite everybody who is part of that conversation to edit, to link, to create images for those notes. So those notes become a living document of what was shared that night, but also what we want to share with others. So the first one, we looked at let's not be afraid of each other, distancing, maybe put anxiety around how we can be with each other. So we wanted to just name that we don't have to be afraid of each other. And people named some of those things. The artist Julie Tolentino is part of that talk. And she talked about how delivery is the new intimacy. That's something that really stuck with me. Then the next event, we talked about space. And it was like, let's dream about space together. And it just so happened that that was also the night of the pink moon. And during those breakout groups, people talked about how they are missing intimacy, how they're yearning for intimacy, but also strategies for intimacy, like loving up on a tree and knowing that the roots of that tree are connected to the roots of the tree where their lover is maybe a half a city away. Or there's an amazing artist who creates these beanbag type things full of mysterious objects, rice and toys, and makes it with different kinds of fabrics, and then rolls around with those kind of beanbag things, and that creates sensations that they weren't familiar with. And then Molly, who I think is on this call tonight, shared a really great strategy about where in your body doesn't get a lot of sensation. So if you tickle yourself there, you will feel like someone else is touching you. And those are just some of the things that we're talking about. Another thing that we've done is, what would an HIV doula do is a collective of people who've been responding long-term to HIV. And we think of a doula as someone who holds space during times of transition, and that HIV is a series of transitions that happen long before you might take an HIV test and long after you might be on medication. And we're interested in how COVID-19 is a major transition for all of us. We're having to transition how we work, how we love, how we live, maybe even how we sleep, how we mourn, how we eat. And in order to help document that in real time, we put out a call to a bunch of our community members to submit kind of like their COVID doula diaries. And this is in connection with an exhibition that we've done called Metanoia, Transformation Through AIDS Archives and Activism, which focuses on the activism of Black women in prison living with HIV in the 1990s, who not only fought for the better treatment of women in prison, but also the early release so that people with AIDS could die at home and in dignity, but also the work I talked about earlier in regards to changing the definition to include AIDS. And we think about that work as, think of lots of things as doula work, and activism is one example of doula work. Maybe some of you think about oral history as a type of doulaship. I think there's lots of ways that we can imagine holding space and how we do that every day and how we can do it special. In the email that we'll send out later, I'll send you a link to the zine. That's my presentation for now. These are the instructions, and I think Amy's gonna jump in now.
Hi, everybody. Let me bring my video up so you can see me. Okay. Hi. So yeah, we thought that one of the benefits of these talks is bringing people together who have shared interests but might not know each other, to listen to each other and learn from each other. So what we'd like to do is give you, just looking at the time, about 15 minutes now in small groups to, and Ted, do you think you could put the prompts back up actually?
I would love to.
I think you can do it even though I'm talking. To introduce yourselves and then to discuss and your choice of these 3 questions. So there's no way for us to let you see this while you're in your breakout group. So those of you who are note-taking types might want to jot these down now. The questions are, what does it mean to witness history? Do you feel like you're witnessing history right now? If so, what histories? And what are methods you can or are using to capture, preserve, or archive this moment? And so we're not going to do formal sort of go around report backs when we come back, because I think it's a little bit too large of a group. But we'd love for you to think as a group about what you might want to share, and maybe ask a spokesperson to share that back with the larger group. And we'll use that to transition into questions. So if there are stories or strategies that you would like to share here, we welcome that. And you should also feel free to bring questions back, either for Ted or for the group. Ted, is there anything else that you would add?
No, I think that's wonderful. wonderful. I really hope that you pick one of these questions and then you get to know each other, and that if you feel a bond, that you exchange contact information with each other to keep the conversation going. Right now, we don't often get to meet strangers, so this is a good opportunity to meet strangers.
Oh, and thank you to the smart people who are putting it in the chat. Hopefully you'll still be able to see the same chat when you go into your breakout rooms. Okay, so you're going to just be kind of asked to go into your rooms, and then I'll bring you back out in about 15 minutes. Hi, everybody. So the groups that I was in people had a lot to say and took some time to listen to each other. So I decided not to rush everybody back too much, but we still have over 20 minutes for discussion. And let me just make sure that Ted is still here and not in a group.
I'm here.
Hi. So Ted, if there's any way that you would like to direct the conversation, feel free. I can monitor the chat and collect questions there. People can also unmute themselves and speak up. We might end up being a little bit large of a group for that, but we can try it. And of course, I have questions too. But if you want to kick us off in any way, please feel free.
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, I'd love to hear if any of the group spokespeople have anything that they want to share out. That would be really thrilling and exciting. Don't be shy.
So I guess I'm in Chicago. My name's Kali Warren, and I'm probably the only one maybe that doesn't have video because my laptop is 10 years old. I was in a very interesting group. I am a librarian archivist at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I think one participant in my group, her name was Jenny, sort of articulated what I was feeling. She was a part of a different group, but I feel this sort of tension between the personal and the professional. And you know, I'm still experiencing the moment. So it's difficult. I have a colleague who's already, you know, sort of set up an online repository and this call for, you know, sort of personal stories, personal narratives during this time. And I had like a visceral sort of emotional response to that and a resistance, an internal resistance to that, because I'm still sort of experiencing that. And I know that others are still experiencing that. So I just wanted to put that out there. I don't want to take up any more time.
I love that you shared that. And I think you remind us that time does not work for everyone in the same way. And I think, I can't speak for other people, I can only speak for me. Hearing you articulate the way time working for you is happening makes it easier for me to do that for myself. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mia. I'm from New Zealand. And in our group, we had a mixture of oral historians and people in the MA program at Columbia, and a woman working in the National Archives of New Zealand, or the National Library there. And one thing that we really talked about, which was interesting, like from Crystal, who's a historian, was in her research, which is about the Métis history, you know, she has this like wishes as a historian that there was more access, greater access to how people were thinking and feeling through history. And so we were really talking about like, what is our responsibility to write down a journal right now, and how would we do that? Like, is it better that it is pen to paper, and then we have some kind of, you know, you might even make a bequest to an archive at some point, and also talking about what, like trying to figure out what or get over our fear of writing something where you feel like your story isn't that important, because you're still, you know, we're all here, we're maybe all educated people who are interested in this stuff and have access to technology, and we're all on this call. So like, what is the, with that kind of privilege, what is the purpose of our story? Or and I guess trying to like overcome that self-judgment or something. Yeah, thanks.
I would encourage people to use the chat box to let the people who are sharing know that you're hearing them. Mia, that was really helpful. And I hope that everyone understands that all of our stories do matter. And we take the burden off people who are already minoritized and burdened by speaking our truth and being accountable for sharing our story, and not putting all the burden on the already burdened to carry the weight of also representing history.
Hi, I was in group 8, and we talked a lot about how to collect information. I mean, we certainly all agree that we are in an historic moment and we're living through it in a unique experience, but we're also limited by our restrictions, our movement restrictions. And one member of our group, who is a filmmaker, said she feels overwhelmed with the idea of trying to go out and put people at risk and involve other people in something that could be dangerous to the health of people involved, and it's just overwhelming. But then we also are all experiencing new technologies, just like we are here together on Zoom, that, you know, taking advantage of these new technologies. So we've talked some about trying to look, you know, compare. Someone brought up NPR StoryCorps, or ways of just from where you are reaching out to record things. And I frankly, you know, it occurred to me that using Zoom and the recording a conversation, a structured conversation on Zoom with small groups about their experience. And one of our members also mentioned how important it is, if, you know, to capture the thoughts and experiences of all types of people, you know, making sure we capture the diversity of experience. And just, you know, not from the great, the very large impacts on people to the very mundane impacts on people, to make sure it's all there. And another thought that I had is that, you know, you'd mentioned about capturing the trauma when it's happening, but we're something that's evolving. So right now we're experiencing something that's a trauma now. And if we capture it now, my thought is that check in with those same people down the road, because this is going to evolve. You know, we realize that our future is going to be very different than it was before this began, that we're all going to be feeling different about our interactions with people. And so if we capture now what our experience is, it might be worthwhile capturing again, maybe 6 months and a year down the road. How is it now?
That's great, Yvette. One thing, What Would an HIV Doula Do held a conversation with a bunch of people who we all saw as kind of working as doulas, including someone who was an early responder in emergency rooms to people who had experienced sexual assault or rape. And their whole program was based on the sooner that you can engage in telling your story after something terrible has happened to you, the sooner you can begin processing it, and that's good long term. And like you said, to have a witness bear your truth over a period of time, I mean, that's such a gift we can give each other if it's possible.
Hi, I'm Cecilia. I'm with Group 4. And we had a fantastic discussion. It was a really, really neat group. And it was wonderful to experience how many different people were doing interesting things in their lives. We had a couple of people from the other end of the world, one person from Australia, another person from New Zealand. And they're doing some really neat active stuff. We had some students from Colombia that were able to join us, and it was cool. We got to talking about methods, and that was a real concern for everybody about how is it that you can engage people effectively when we can't be in the same space with each other. And talked about what our best tools were for actually getting engaged with folks, and just basically quizzing each other about that. I heard some great things. We all are all working with different populations, and the populations, which are all part of what community. Thank you very much, Cordell. But those populations are all different groups have a different technology adoption and access, as well as whether they're a native or not. with some forms of technology. So that dramatically affects our ability to be able to capture their stories, as well as to have access to them to even get their stories. Plus also too, it affects their sense of safety, which I think is incredibly important. And our ability to connect with them emotionally when you're separated by the technology. So we were just talking about all those different strategies. We also had a great discussion about education and how education is going to be changing with this at this point in time in history. Because someone mentioned that universities are going to a pass-fail system right now, which kind of leaves up the question is exactly, well, am I educated or not, or what is education? It was a fantastic discussion, and you guys cut us off way too soon.
Sorry.
Anybody else?
I was just thinking about what you just said, Ted, about the importance of like telling a story right after you've experienced something and how that can be therapeutic. And one thing I've been thinking about with what we're living through right now is how I'm like feeling to get really hard to make a story out of it because we don't know where it's going. And I find myself just like doing all this like about my own experience, work in my own head to try to like make some kind of story into it. And like, what are the turning points? But it's like, it keeps kind of falling apart because things keep changing. And so it's a really interesting time to do oral history. I think we found that after doing oral history is like very shortly after September 11th too, that people had a hard time making a coherent story, and we worried about whether there was something potentially harmful or even traumatizing about like asking people to talk about something that they couldn't narrate, because there's something really healing often about like controlling an experience by putting it in the narrative. Brian Carmichael raised their hand.
Oh, I see a Brian. Is that our Brian Carmichael?
Oh, there's Brian. I'm gonna unmute you, Brian. Oh.
I spent most of the night wrestling with the video, so now it's the audio. Can you hear me? I was just gonna say, for me, when I was in prison in California in the 80s and early 90s, when we were doing all the HIV activism, by the time I got out in 1993, I was so traumatized that I couldn't talk. I couldn't even tell a friend about what happened there and all the hundreds of guys that died without breaking down. Like, I could not even talk about it. I couldn't get even a fraction of the story out. And that went all the way until a couple years ago when J.D. Davids wrote me and asked me if I would share my story through letters. And he would send me questions and I would answer them. And then, that led to a series of articles in thebody.com and basically got my life back on track. But I couldn't talk about it for 25 years until somebody found that right safe way to get me to engage. And for me, that was just sitting in my cell, writing a letter over like a week time span. And like every paragraph was traumatic. But once I got it done, now Ted knows a lot of my story, but anyway, I just think it's important to find, like, for every different person and every different trauma they experience, there's got to be a way to reach them, and it might not be a universal way, but each person has an avenue. That's all. This is my first speaking in a Zoom meeting.
You're doing great. Thank you for sharing that. I love that idea that every person has their own right way to tell a story, and it's a matter of finding it. That's brilliant. It's so important.
Thanks for putting this on, Ted.
Oh, it wasn't me. I was just the guest.
Can I raise a question from our group?
Yes, please.
We were talking about the difference between documenting what's happening now versus documenting what's happened in the past, and questioning what sort of skills we need to document what's happening now. Anyone who has any input on that, I'd love to hear it.
I've been thinking about that too. And Ted, I'd be curious with your thoughts and how much part of what we have to know in order to document the now is sort of how to listen to ourselves carefully, especially when we're documenting something that we're all living through.
Yeah, I would say that we're all probably finding out ways to document it in ways we don't know, or ways that we're not recognizing, or ways that we're not valuing. I would say, like, I like the idea that our stories are in our bodies. And so I think it's really interesting to not even worry about technology or recording or the printed word or anything like that. I would say, like, just check in with your body and how are you storing stories already? Are you crying? Is your jaw tight? How are your bowel movements? Where's your sex drive? These are all ways that our stories are being held or expressed or trying to get its way out. So I would start there. And I'm happy to talk a little bit later about other methods, but I really just want us to stay with the body for a second.
You know, something you said in the beginning of your discussion was about the fact that the stories that we're living in are affecting the stories of our lives. You know, that how are the community's experience are telling a story and how people fit into it or don't, or how we challenge that story. I think that's so incredibly important. And what you just said as far as how the body expresses story, I know of a group of women who are affected by something called Cushing's disease. It's a cortisol related disease. It's a tumor either on your adrenals or your pituitary. And it happens to women mostly in midlife. And it's 70% of the people who have it are women. And when you start hearing their life stories, it's almost like the COVID is actually telling the story. I'm not the COVID, but the Cushing's is telling the story of what led up to that point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think Carlin had something.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Something that's coming to mind is that as media makers, as storytellers, you know, a lot of oral historians obviously on this call, I feel like it can be tempting when considering like the what is our role in this kind of time question to think like, oh, I'm an oral historian, like I ought to be doing oral histories, right? Like, and the idea of like what method is the right one, and sort of how can we, what does it mean to be documentary experience right now and stuff, and kind of having the idea of like a go-to medium for working in, of like, oh, I usually make audio, or I usually make film, or I usually make oral history interviews. I think that experimenting with different media in a time like this can be really productive and generative, because it like takes the pressure off in some way, right? To sort of go from being, to having your sort of professional hat on to having an amateur hat on, in a medium that maybe you're not as practiced in or what have you, and sort of I've been finding that that's freeing in a lot of ways.
I think that dovetails with something that Ruth put in the comments that's so important, is this, like, Ruth, do you want to say it or should I read it? I'm going to take silence as an invitation to read it.
Please read it.
Oh, okay. It's about, Ruth says, I'm wary of the impulse to make experience productive because of the way that so much in the US culture seems to me, as a stranger here, capitalized on. And I think for me, that is connected to what Carlin's saying, is that we don't have to be productive. We can, I would say that for now, but I think everyone can find their own understanding of, like, you have to do anything. I think a lot of us who were productive in the early weeks of the crisis were people, that was how we knew how to make sense of it. That was our trauma impulse. And now that it's becoming clear that we're part of a long emergency, I think we'll see a shift. And I think some of us will become less productive, and everybody, like Brian said, everybody will have their own responses to the traumas that we're experiencing. And I do think we just have to, as the doula in me would say, is like hold space for ourselves and each other in those differences.
Kat, I had a couple of things I wanted to say, but I don't know who else is out there Q-wise.
Mia and Brian and you all want to talk. And so why don't you start, and then we'll go Mia and then Brian, if that's okay, Amy. Yeah, okay. So you go, Emily.
So thanks, and thanks for this. It's really, I want to say one thing, which is that I think that first question of, like, do you feel like you're living through history? And this idea of sort of what do we produce and how do we take our technical, whatever our sort of professional lens versus a personal lens, and you know, everything that our bodies are doing or making is the document of this time. I think the thing about being swept up in history, we are always in history, but in a moment where the potency of living in history is so incredibly palpable, and there's been such a frame shift and such a dramatically abbreviated amount of time, you know, is this sort of loss of control over the idea that I can be documenting, I can be being a journalist, I can be, you know, and realize I'm being pulled through something, and everything I do, my shopping lists, my will be of interest to somebody who is probably not me, because we are, you know, in this sort of moment. And so just sort of this idea that our lives now are the stuff of history, and that will be part of a sort of ongoing reckoning. And then I wanted to say that I was still thinking about something that was shared in my group. One of the participants is, and it's their story, so I won't sort of use names, but had lost both parents to AIDS and at 7, and thinking about documentation now and sort of child documentation. I have 2 children, and thinking about the ways that those of us that have children in our lives can be helping to create the archive that they might want to see later, that they might want to know about, you know, whether that's the drawings or the questions or, you know. And so I had made that association after our discussion, but I wanted to share it because I do think of, you know, stewarding some of this documentation for children feels important. And if it's something people are thinking about or doing, I'd love to be part of that conversation.
I think you and Ruth will be in touch. Amy, I'm looking for you for direction. Should we take more comments?
Well, I know we had 2 other people in the queue. I just want to kind of.
Mia was just waving.
Oh, Mia was just waving. Hi, Mia. And Brian wanted to say something too. So why don't we hear from Brian, and then we can sort of close for those who need to go, and make sure we you know, share next steps. And then if folks want to hang out, you're also welcome to after that. But Brian, I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Hey, I'll be brief. I was just gonna, it kind of goes along with what everyone has said. But the immediacy of, like, I'll go back to the early days in California. every time there would be a newspaper article out about anything and anything to do with prison or corrections, I would write the reporter and thank him. And then at some point I would say, like, this part of your story was inaccurate, and if you want evidence, you can contact me or this person, this attorney, you know. And we had such a group between ACT UP and the press and the politicians. But it was a coalition, and we never could have done it with people out there without their support. But this is what I wanted to show you. I have Ted's seen the file at the center, but I have this. I don't know if you can see like these old articles. This is like before the internet, but anytime an article would come out, or there'd be like a radio interview on Pacifica, we would make little notes and plaster them around the prison, and tell people, just because so much of what, you know, an oppressive system like that, it wants to discourage you from even dreaming or thinking. And when we would tell somebody, watch Channel 7 tonight or listen to KQED tonight, and they would see the story being told, it really, you could see like it raised everybody's spirits. And I think that's just a microcosm of out here. And I think knowing that our stories are being told and other people knowing that we're all telling the story will empower them and encourage them, give them hope. That's it.
Thank you, Brian. You said, for me, you said lots of important things there, but the thing that I heard is that we need witnesses and outside voices. We need proof that we exist and that our stories matter and stories are being heard. And it reminds me of this thing that I learned at Union Theological Seminary across from Columbia, is that collective trauma recovery suggestions are that we need people to share their stories, and then we need like active witnessing. We need active hearers, and then together the active listeners and the people who told their story make a new story together, and that new story is the beginning of starting to heal the trauma. And so Brian, what you just talked about makes a lot of sense. It's like you needed proof that people were witnessing it, and you needed each other to see it so that you can make a new story about freedom, about so many things. Thank you.
Okay, so I know that we're about at our sort of planned end time, so I wanted to make sure to just especially thank Ted for joining us and sharing this really important history and making the space for us to talk with each other and think about, and I was start to answer some of these questions, start to ponder these questions. We will send around some follow-up notes within the next couple of days. We'll also send around information about upcoming oral history events that we're doing to sort of continue this conversation. We have a training May 9th on how to record online, alongside a bunch of other oral history trainings, and a big interactive exhibit created by our students opening on May 1st. So I invite all of you to those. And I think what I'd like to do, I also wanted to mention just out loud that we did record this with the intention of sharing it with people who couldn't be here. Since lots of people were speaking, if you have any concerns with that, definitely let me know. We can edit. Otherwise, we'll send it out again in the next couple of days. So with that, I'm going to formally close. Ted, is there anything you wanted to say in terms of sort of last words or next steps? And then we can, I can stick around a little bit to continue chatting if other folks want to.
Just gratitude to everyone for sharing their stories, and thank you to you, Amy, and I'm excited to be in community with all of you.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. Ted, are you able to stick around a little bit more if people want to keep chatting?
Yeah, I have abandonment issues, so I definitely won't be leaving anytime soon.
There's more questions in the chat too that came up that we didn't quite get to, so there's more food for talk. And I think people should also feel free to unmute themselves and talk if there's something they'd like to say. Can I just say, Ted, something I was thinking about a lot this whole time was you were talking about like what we hear about the AIDS epidemic. versus what you know, and what the reality is, and also what's in the archive. So, you know, there is this, the real story is in the archive. And so what is the gap between what we archive and then the stories that actually circulate in the mass media? I was thinking about that when Brian was talking too.
Yeah, and which archive, right? Like, because of the white supremacy and patriarchy of library studies and all that stuff, it's like what gets tagged where and how do you find things. One of my big pet peeves is when HIV/AIDS archives get only put in LGBT buckets. Like, for example, StoryCorps was, you know, some of his early inspiration for StoryCorps were his straight neighbors who were living with HIV, and yet when you go to StoryCorps, the oral histories are under LGBT. And so what does that tell somebody who isn't LGBT that's living with HIV? That their stories don't matter, that their stories don't fit? Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Also, you said more food for thought. It made me think, you know, people used to eat together. As strangers, we would, like, at this point, we'd be eating whatever cheese was left on some weird plate.
I know. It's a different, it's like we were just in a conversation with the Oral History Association about how to try to create networking and like hangout opportunities at virtual conferences, and like, can you use Second Life if people have like avatars and they walk around and talk to each other? Like, is that different than having us all in these little boxes? And
here's my cat. That's my avatar.
Can we eat your cat?
I ate in my small group, but I muted myself so they couldn't hear me chewing. I have like it's sort of funny, not funny. It's not actually a joke. It's a little, I find the current, whatever, like mini boomlet of AIDS crisis revisitation stories so triggering. And I'm just wondering if there's just like they make me mad. They make me distracted.
I don't know. Is there a solution to that?
I mean, number one, Emily, what would an HIV doula do is creating that document. It's called 20 Questions for Writers and Journalists to Consider Before Writing Stories About HIV and COVID, a really catchy title. But basically it's a set of questions and guidelines for writers and journalists, so they're not making stupid, triggering, oversimplified comparisons between the two. And I think some requests for you to participate in that document are in your inbox.
No, I did. My stuff is in there.
Okay, good.
My stuff is in there. But then T Magazine, then like a Times Style magazine has like a giant glossy recapitulation of the greatest hits of the AIDS crisis revisitation with a art shot of really brave, wonderful, bold, act up members, the vast majority of whom are white, and it just it literally is like a visceral reaction to sort of the history continuing to be reinscribed at a moment when, as an example for the ongoing history, which is proving all of the exclusions of that history wrong, right? You know, in terms of where disease lives in race, in bodies, in class, all that stuff. So, yeah. Thanks for just giving me a chance to say that.
I also want to make space for Denise's beautiful question. What have you learned in your work about interviewing people for whom the future is uncertain? And just from knowing the people who are still on this call, I'm seeing like Liza, Suzanne, Amy, you all have experience with this in oral history world, but I'm also seeing Shanti and Christy, who I know also have experience in doing this through social work or through just your everyday archival lives. I wonder if other people can take Denise's question.
Ted, you didn't call my name, but
oh, Benji, you're still here. Also, Benji.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I think something I've been thinking about a lot and came up in our small group actually, because Carlin was in our group and she talked about how she's currently interviewing the interviewers for the, I forget the long name for it, but the Columbia Project on COVID-19. And she talked about how those interviews, and actually Denise was in our group too, you both talked about how the current interviews for that project are so grounded in the present. Like they start with, you know, how was your day? You know, and the present just suffuses the interviews so much. And that connects with something I've been thinking about, you know, down here in Little Rock, where the crisis does not feel nearly as present, not nearly in the sense of like mortality, you know. People are just stuck at home, you know, and for us right now, like, as you know, as privileged as it is, like I'm trying to think of ways to help people pass this, you know what I mean? And when I say privilege, like I don't mean to actually diminish that either, because I don't know, like lots of old folks that I go to church with are stuck at home right now, and some of them live alone and they're getting their groceries delivered. So what's a way to connect like the present need to connect and talk with the abiding need that oral history always addresses, which is like to talk about the past, right? And so anyways, what I'm trying to get at is that I think oral history was actually so well designed as like a flexible practice for this kind of moment, precisely because good oral history projects always bring the uncertainty of the present into the line of questioning, right? Like if you're spending 2 hours with somebody on their life history, what you decide to ask about, there's so little you can ask about really. And so having a consciousness of the present and the present needs, you know, like for me, like most of my work right now is on desegregation in Little Rock. And so I'm trying to orient my questions to how are people living it today, and how does that connect with what I don't know, what I'm trying to find out about how people used to live it. So anyways, yeah, I feel like this moment is exciting for the field because it's like bringing to the surface the patterns that have always been there in terms of society at large and in terms of our practice, like the main things that we rely on. It's just intensified, it's heightened, but nothing's necessarily, I don't know, new, I don't know.
I want to try with Denise's question because it's actually quite challenging to me, because I think one of the biggest projects I ever did was with Liza, and Benji was part of it too, were the oral histories with the Smithsonian. We were interviewing artists who were deeply impacted by HIV/AIDS. And for the majority, these were people who are now in somewhat stable lives or have some idea of stability, whether it's economic or historic or career-wise. And being interviewed by the Smithsonian maybe like enshrined that to them or something like that. But I would say that something that happened is talking about 10 years ago or 20 years ago actually destabilized them and made the future less sure, because now the past was up for discussion. And that was part of the doula work around being an oral historian in those moments, is holding space for people. I mean, you probably know this from your own experience. You can see you can see a fracture happen in a face. And as an oral historian, I feel an ethical, I want to hold that space for them. I don't want to fill it, but I want to hold it. That's what I would say. And I'm not picking on anyone here. I would say that I think social workers are often someone who are using oral history skills to talk to people whose future is uncertain, and they have to help the person become a narrator. And I think that's quite interesting to think about the social work oral historian connection. Again, there's so many brilliant people. I know that we're all in our feelings, but if anyone wants to share, like Christy, who just raised her hand.
Hi, I'm gonna talk. I think that's a really interesting question about the how to account for this moment when people don't know what's going to happen. And one experience that I had recently, well, in the past few years, was working on a project about the first AIDS ward in San Francisco and at San Francisco General Hospital. And that was it started in '83. the nurses created this AIDS ward in 1983. And for me, I was the archival producer for this film. And when I was looking back at that material, the thing that was really important and kind of resonant was the journalists. I mean, one thing that was really striking was that journalists who we often, I mean, just like mainstream journalists, were there and they were covering, you know, that's the material that survived. So I think kind of engaging them and getting them to ask the right kinds of questions is a really difficult thing for us to do, but it's important, you know, for the historical record. But one thing that I feel like the journalists who created records that still had resonance, the thing that really resonated was when they actually asked people who were experts, you know, doctors and people on the front lines, caretakers, nurses, what they didn't know, like not just to speak as an expert, but like what they were scared of, what was uncertain, what was, you know, I think that's a tricky thing to ask people when you go into like a situation where there's people who are kind of, you know, professionals or experts and they're very busy. But I think just recording that is really, really important, because I didn't, you know, that's what made it sink in emotionally, that like, if you were a nurse in 1983, you know, nobody knew what the vector was. Like, it wasn't clear. Like, it was, you know, how were people making decisions? Like, there were things that they knew that it probably wasn't like super, you know, immediately deadly. Like, people weren't dying who were taking care of people. Like, it was that far into, you know, it's a little bit into the epidemic. But so there were kinds of evidence that people had from experience, but then there was all the stuff that people didn't know, and how, just like hearing how people made decisions in that situation, I think it was really rare to find those little nuggets, but it was really important. And I feel like we're in that situation now. It's like, nobody really knows how to make a decision, you know, about how to be safe, or how to get, I mean, in my small group, we were talking, I was saying that I'm struggling with the idea of like getting a crew together to go out and film, because that would be putting people at risk. Like, I don't really know there's not enough information to really assess the, you know, the risks of that, or what you're asking people to actually, you know, do. So I feel like for people that do have access to those spaces where there's experts and there's people who are kind of like, you know, have a lot of information, to ask them also what they don't understand, or what they're scared of, or, you know, what they're having nightmares about. All that stuff really, really, for me, watching it 30 years later, 35 years later, resonated a lot. So that's one thought. Okay, I'm gonna mute myself again.
I want to make space for an interesting conversation that's happening on the side. Noah asked a question about seeing if people want to help with a project, and then Eliza, I think I'm saying your name right, Eliza Becker is listing so many important populations that also are being deeply impacted by COVID, and I think inviting us to think about how those stories are being collected or not, and the role that journalists or oral historians or social workers could play. So I just wanted to lift that up. And Christy, did you want to share a little bit? You mentioned some thoughts, but do you want to speak it out?
Sure. I just was thinking that, you know, you asked about sort of social work as a perspective. I think one of the things that's interesting is that while social workers might have access to some of these stories, that's almost the opposite of being part of history in terms of how stories get shared or captured. And so my daughter came home, the kettle's on. And so there's that thing of, there might be these stories, and often these stories reside in a worker and in a service user, but they're not going anywhere else. And so and one of the stories that came to mind for me, we had a major environmental disaster in the province where I live a few years ago. And one of the things that was being done was this amazing behind the scenes work tracking domestic violence abusers who were taking advantage of the disaster to show up at evacuation centers and stalk their partners. And so there was this really like phenomenal collaborative work happening that nobody knows about because it was under some kind of confidentiality rules. And so people don't get to learn those strategies when those things are under confidentiality. So that was disjointed, but those are some thoughts. Another thing when you're thinking about those different professions is in Canada, we've learned that a great number of the hospital staff mortality has been cleaners. And we hear a lot about doctors and nurses, but actually in Ontario, it's cleaners.
Wow.
And cleaners' roles are seen as disposable in some of our political systems. So just like making sure we capture that.
I'm Aliza Becker. Just wanted to first make sure that my name is correctly pronounced. It's actually an Israeli Hebrew name. I didn't pick it, but it's mine. Thank you. So I was just, starting to think about all the particular, especially impacted populations. Last night I got an email from a Chinese friend in Pittsburgh, and she just said it was horrific being an Asian right now, and she didn't say anything else, but it just made me think about all these people. And another friend's nephew died, and there were like 30 people in his factory that were infected, and 7 who have died. And in Chicago, 70% of the people who have died are African Americans. What does that mean for the community? So it hadn't occurred to me about all these populations. And then the other question I had for Shanti is, like, I have a friend who works for ABC. She's a journalist in Chicago. And, I would love to think about like getting these stories from our community and working with her since that's her profession. Any thoughts on where I might start? Because it would be something we could do together that's local and, for my own community here.
I mean, I think now just, contacting journalists with stories is one thing we can do. And there's also, I feel like everyone's taking, the whole question of like, you guys have all probably thought about this a lot more, but archiving like social media and archiving what people are recording on their cell phones and chats and all that stuff is like super. When I think about, what survives from 1983 in San Francisco, it's like so much stuff is lost, right? But there were, student films and oral histories that I found of the peer counselors, and there's just a lot of different kinds of media. But I think, yeah, working with journalists is really tricky. And Suzanne also asked in the chat about outtakes, and that's what I'm always looking for as an archival person and working in documentary. Like you don't want the edited thing that was on TV. You don't want the broadcast piece. You want the whole tape that has all of those other moments, and that's where you find the real moments. And I don't know. It's really, I'm actually not sure, because I usually work on things that are at least 20 years in the past. I'm not sure how that's working now, but I have a feeling that the challenge would be not so much that people aren't saving it, but that it's super siloed and proprietary. So it's just not gonna, like a news station they have zero incentive to make that available. They'll make the actual broadcast available, but they're gonna want to hang on to that in case they ever want to make a documentary, or there's just no incentive for them to make that. And sometimes I try to like find the producer and convince them that it's an important thing, and it usually exists somewhere, I think, I don't know, maybe it would be possible now to like get some kind of, you know, even if you got like a few journalists to just like pool all their outtakes. But again, I think the big obstacle is actually, it's not technological, it's not like the will of the journalist, it's just the media conglomeration and the kind of corporatization of information and ownership now. I'm actually not sure how to get around that. I think sometimes journalists save it themselves, you know, like maybe you could ask your friend who's a journalist to like save it and think about, you know, bequeathing their archive to a university or you know, an oral history place, or maybe, I don't know, maybe that's one way to do it, like just encourage individual journalists to actually save their tapes and their well, it's not tapes anymore, right? Their files in a way that's gonna be accessible in the future. But I don't know. It's a tricky. It's very idiosyncratic in terms of what survives, and I fear that. I mean, I think that physical tapes actually, that's where. I mean, when I find a news station that has physical tapes in their, you know, basement, like that's where you can find that stuff. But in the digital age, I'm not sure. I actually don't know how that would, like, somebody would have to keep a hard drive, and I mean, I think people should record it to tape, you know, honestly. Like, it's just things get lost. But yeah.
I think as a group of people who are well suited to want to hear people share their stories, we take listening for granted. And something that a bunch of us on a call that Suzanne initiated on the weekend were talking about is the importance of listening right now. And going back to Ruth's comment about being productive, it's like, it's also okay to take this time to research and listen to things and listen to people. Like there's this amazing Vice auto program that started now. I think it's called Dispatches, and every day there's like a 3 to 5 minute audio piece, and it's just somebody from around the world talking about their COVID experience. And it's how I learned that there's Zoom sex parties happening in Bali. It's also how I learned that one of the fears that people have taking the subway right now in New York is how actually empty it is. You know, I'm hearing all these stories, and so one of the challenges I have is like to switch my mindset and to be like, oh, how do I listen better? Khalid, do you want to talk on that? That's such an important thing to say.
So you can't tell because there is no video. I don't have any video, but I'm Black. So I think about this quite a bit, particularly since in my research, I talk quite a bit about the formerly enslaved in the United States and also in the Caribbean. And basically, you know, we don't often think about this, but this moment we're not only impacted by the pandemic, but there's also violence coming from our leadership. So this is a moment of instability and violence that, you know, marginalized people experience all the time. Now it's everybody. So I think that, you know, the marginalized have a lot to say in this moment, though I did mention at the beginning that, you know, it's difficult for me to sort of articulate or, you know, think about projects or, you know, think about my instruction or different approaches to instruction and using Zoom and all of these conversations that people are having to be productive. I'm, you know, at this moment of processing, which you said, you know, you confirmed that everybody's at a different point at this time. But I have been thinking quite a bit about how, you know, this violence sort of disturbs, the dream space. So when Brian said what he said, I was like, man, that's it. You know, these moments of instability, you know, this is the connection that is, you know, sort of the prison logic, you know, the logic of the United States, which is based on settler colonialism and chattel slavery. There's a through line to all of that. And it is to create this instability in marginalized communities, and also to create that instability in, you know, people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. That instability sort of disturbs the imagination. I could go on, but I'm sorry. I get excited about this.
You can see that we're all nodding.
Lisa,
Yeah. If the screen is 21 people listening, and lots of head nodding, and that kind of special smile that emerges when you realize that someone's saying the truth that you needed to hear. So I hope that you can feel that we're with you.
Great, thank you.
Also, the smiles are really cute. So imagine like the cutest people in the world smiling and nodding with you.
I've got some bedtime responsibilities coming up here, folks, so I'm gonna have to go, but I'll leave this open for as long as you want it. Thank you all again for taking the time to talk and be together. I hope we can find more ways to keep this going.
Thank you. I just want to say that one of the struggles I have, I set aside time every day to call and listen to certain friends, to try that support piece is super, super important. And I just haven't even thought about documenting anything, because just keeping myself present and keeping myself thinking about my health and structuring my time and thinking about my other friends is such a huge thing. And yeah, so that just seems the challenge, since I haven't even thought about doing more in terms of documenting till now.
That's such a hugely important thing that you're doing. Please know that we need to be doing that. Keeping people alive and wanting to live in the present is really important. Part of having abandonment issues is creating boundaries. And so I'm going to suggest that we give it until 8:10, and then we say goodbye. Does anyone object or have a counter boundary suggestion?
Now you got us all scared of your boundaries, Ted.
I'm
just playing. Just teasing.
I was going to say everyone should be scared of my lack of boundaries.
How are you feeling after just leading a 2-hour discussion?
I don't know. I think people who are teaching online can also talk about this. There's like a kind of exhaustion that comes, but there's also a kind of high. I don't know how to explain it, but I know that it will take me a long time to come down tonight.
I just want to take the time to appreciate you, Ted, for putting this together, for really pushing us to think big. It's you know, I was on another oral history training. Other than this, it was totally like listen and ask questions, and this was really creative. It engaged my mind. I feel like I've grown tremendously, and my mind is just buzzing with ideas. And thank you so much for even if it was you're the guest, this was fabulous, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if other folks have been, I appreciate that, and I take that, I absorb it, thank you. I also want to say that if folks have been to other events put on by the Columbia Masters Oral History Program, it's like hard to leave not overwhelmed. And so that's always been exciting. Yeah.
I wonder if I can ask for some clarification, Ted. I think this is something that you said. I think you mentioned taking, you said something like taking the burden off of people who are already overburdened to tell history. And then we're also talking about and bringing up people whose stories are being, who are overburdened and whose stories are kind of being, you know, they're either too untidy to fit into a media piece, or they're too really graphic, or they're not graphic enough in terms of this, like pushing the fear of our mortality on us through news stories, and I just I'm kind of thinking about how to hold those two things together in the same space, in terms of, you know, actions that I can take as somebody who you know, can document but is also hesitating to document.
Yeah, what I would say, what I would begin with is the idea of a media ecology, that we live in a media ecology that holds the mainstream news, where we get the kind of prepackaged stories that maybe we don't need or that we've heard 100 times. And then we have, you know, the whole world of, you know, there's how many oral history projects that are amazing do not get the ears that it deserves. But that doesn't mean that people haven't done the labor of creating it. They've done the labor of being a narrator. They've done the labor of being an interviewer. So I just want us to think about that we live in a media ecology. And the first part is, I think so often, and I'll just speak really frankly, white middle-class people with a complicated relationship to their own privilege often don't feel that their stories are worth documenting, but understand that stories are worth documenting. And so they often, especially early in a career, gravitate towards the most heinous sounding stories or the most dramatic stories. And those are often the stories of the people who are already having to answer all the questions for the social worker, answer all the questions to the police officer when they're stopped on the street, answer all the questions to the landlord because their rent is a second late, answer all the questions to their family or to just white culture in general. And then a well-meaning, truly decent person comes up and says, will you share your story? And it's like, too much. And so I'm curious about how we can find that balance between like making space to the other thing I would say is that often white middle-class people like myself often forget to hold ourselves accountable, and we forget to put ourselves through the rigor of these processes. So something like the summer school oral history training is you have to do all that so you know what you're about to put someone through, because it's so easy for some of us to ask brilliant questions, but so hard for us to be the one being looked at and having to account for our bodies and our privilege and even the stuff in between. Like, I'm not even talking about being guilty, just having like, I think we actually have a hard time accounting for our pleasure sometimes, accounting for the things that we like, you know? I just wanted to say that. So I would say we have to find a balance between making sure that the stories that are too often under rug swept in the mainstream don't overfill the rest of the media ecology. And we see that with HIV/AIDS history. As soon as you scratch the surface of the white gay guy stories, you find an amazing treasure trove. Like Amy was saying earlier, it's all in the archive, but it's because of white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia, the gatekeepers don't let it all out. Okay, I got off track there at the end, but everything else was pretty decent.
Can I just say, oh, sorry, you're at 8:10. Oh my God, we're at 8:11. Ted, we plunged past your boundary. I guess I just feel I need to sort of say again, like having, you know, any people, like spending time in paper archives, it's the things that are written on the overleaf of the sheet of paper and the notes that are jotted down, and, you know, the anxiety about documenting or not documenting. I mean, just don't throw things away right now. In some ways, just you know, the box where you put the note and the shopping list and the things you crossed off, or the people you meant to call. I mean, all of that stuff is what matters. And so I feel like there's both the desire not to, there's my son. That matters too. But I just want to send that out there with a lot of love. Mom.
You're muted, Ted.
Ted, we really want to hear you.
Ted, are you with us?
Okay, there we go. My computer froze. I was just going to say, as a closing ritual, if anybody who maybe hasn't used their voice and wants to use their voice, wants to make a sound or a nod or a grunt, you're more than welcome to. So I think we should all unmute ourselves, and on the count of 3, make a sound. Does that sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
And then the last thing we can do is Timothy Dwight does this thing where he counts to 3 and then he claps, and that's for all of us. So on the count of 3, let's clap and then cut it. Okay? 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Ted. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.